I can't see. Jessica closed her eyes and opened them again, but the darkness remained. She tried again, realizing with a rising panic that she could not move. The air stank of something rotten, turning her stomach, and she forced herself to breathe deeply. I'll stop noticing if I breathe. She tried again to move, testing to see what was restraining her. She was confined in a sitting position. Her wrists were tied together behind her. Her arms pulled uncomfortably around the back of a wooden chair and her ankles bound to its legs. She pulled against the restraints, almost tipping the chair over as she struggled to free herself. But she could not break away. Then there was light. Jessica stopped moving. She blinked in the sudden brightness, her vision resolving. Charlie's impostor stood in the light of the window, revealed in her true form. She was undeniably an animatronic, but she was nothing like any other Jessica had ever seen. She was human size, the same size as Charlie, modeling in a human woman of sorts. Her bifurcation face, painted with rosy cheeks and a bright red nose, and her enormous round eyes were rimmed with long black lashes. She even had hair, two silky orange pigtails sprang from the sides of her head, gleaming unnaturally in the light. Jessica didn't tell what her hair was made of. She was wearing a red and white costume, or rather, the male segments of her body were painted to look like a costume at her waist. A red skirt stuck out playfully. She was standing very still and she was staring straight at Jessica. Jessica froze, afraid to breathe, but the creature just tilted her metal head to the side, watching. Her animatronic face looked familiar, but she still felt fuzzy and couldn't recall where she'd seen it. I don't suppose you give me a hand with these. Jessica lifted her feet the quarter inch the restraint would allow. The animatronic smell. No, I don't suppose I would, she said, her voice alarmingly unchanged. Jessica shrank back, revolted at the sound of her friend's voice coming from this singular new creature. Who are you? Jessica asked. I'm Charlie. Jessica looked around the dimly lit room helplessly, apart from the chair. The only object she could see was a gigantic old-fashioned coal-burning furnace, with a warm orange glow emanating from the thin vents in its door. At least, the creature began, part of me is Charlie. She held her hand out in front of her, steadying it. Jessica looked up and suddenly it was Charlie standing in the light of the window, looking confused and innocent. It's strange, the animatronic said. I have these memories. I know they don't belong to me, and yet at the same time they do. She paused, and Jessica returned to wrestling with the knots. I know that they don't belong to me because I don't feel anything when they come to mind. They were just there, like a long road you walk on, lined with billboards of things happening somewhere else. Well, what do you feel? Jessica muttered, trying to drag out the conversation as her survival instincts kicked in. The animatronic girl's eyes darted toward her. I feel disappointment, she said, her voice growing more tense. Desperation. She looked out the window. A father's disappointment and a daughter's desperation, she whispered. Henry? Jessica gasped. The girl looked at her back at her. No, not Henry. He was more brilliant than Henry. I watched my father work from a distance, a great, great distance. Her voice trailed off. Jessica waited for her to go off, half forgetting that she was trying to escape. I see everything clearly now, the animatronic continued, but in my memories, things are much simpler, which made it so much more painful. Now I know that people are all fading, fragile, and sequential. But when you are a child, your parents are everything. They are your world, and you don't know anything else. When you are a little girl, your father is your world. How tragic and miserable such an existence is. Jessica felt a wave of dizziness and looked up to see that the animatronic now appeared as the clown again, but the image paused. Suddenly, it was Charlie in the light, but the moment's disruption and illusion was enough to remind Jessica of where she was and that she had to get away. The animatronic girl stood beside the only window in the room. There was a door nearby. She was closer to it than the animatronic. Not that she could count on outrunning her. What else am I going to try? Tentatively keeping her eyes fixed on her capture. Jessica started working her wrists back and forth, trying to loosen the rope that held her. The girl watched, but did not move to stop her, so Jessica kept going. That's the flaw, and the greatest sin of humanity, the girl said. You were born with none of your intelligence, but all of your heart, fully capable of feeling pain and torment, but with no power to understand. It opens you up to abuse, to neglect, to unimaginable pain. All you do is feel. She stirred her hands again. All you can do is feel, but never understand. What a sick power is that you were given. The ropes always seemed to tighten as Jessica pulled at them, and Jessica felt tears of frustration pricking at her eyes. No wonder she doesn't seem to care if I try to escape, she thought bitterly. If I could just see the knots. She stopped moving and took a deep breath, then closed her eyes. Find the knot. Ignore the robot. Jessica fumbled with her right hand, searching for the end of the knot, bending her wrist painfully. Excuse me. At last, she found the end of the rope and grasped it. The rope tightened, but she inched her fingers along until she came to the base of the knot, then began to carefully push the end of the rope up through the final loop. I wanted to desperately to have been the one at that stage, but it was always her. All of his love went into her. You're talking about Afton. Jessica stopped, and Shirley nodded confrontation. William Afton never made anything with love, Jessica snarled. I should rip you in half. Charlie's appearance flashed. The animatronic's face and body seemed to break, then resemble in an instant. For a moment, her expression wavered, and vulnerability showing in her face, but she quickly collected herself. She was his obsession. The animatronic twisted her hair around her fingers. He walked on her day and night, the clown baby with bright orange pigtails, petite enough to be sweet and approachable, but large enough to swallow you whole, she laughed. Jessica pulled the rope at last time. She had managed to undo the first knot, breathing heavily with effort. Jessica opened her eyes. The animatronic had not moved from the window. She seemed still to be watching with a kind of amused interest. Jessica gritted her teeth and closed her eyes and started on the next knot. I wanted to be her, the girl whispered, the focus of his attention, the center of his world. You're delusional. Jessica snickered as she struggled with the rope, trying to keep her distracted. You're a robot. You're not his child. The animatronic pulled the chair away from the wall and sat with a pained expression. One night, I snuck out of bed to see her. I've been told not to 100 times. I pulled the sheet away. She was gleaming bright, beautifully, standing over me. She had happy red cheeks and lovely red dress. Jessica paused in her work, confused. Who is she talking about? It's odd because I remember looking down at the little girl as well. A strange scene through both sets of eyes now, but as I said, one is more than a data tape, a record of my first capture, my first kill. The animatronic's eyes flared bright in the darkness. The little girl approached me and pulled the sheet away. I felt nothing. It's more than a record of what happened, but there is feeling. My feeling is I pulled the sheet away, and I stood in awe before this creature my father loved, this daughter he made for himself, the daughter who was better than me, the daughter he wished I had been. I wanted to be her so badly. Charlie's appearance faded, revealing the painted clown, and Jessica sighed as a wave of nausea and dizziness passed over her again. So I did what I was built to do, the girl said, and stopped talking. The room was silent. When the last knot slipped loose and the rope fell onto the floor, Jessica's eyes popped open in surprise. She leaned forward, moving her numb, tingling arms down to her ankles as she watched the girl who simply continued to observe her. Jessica undid the knots that held her ankles quickly. They were looser, done carelessly, and she put her feet flat on the floor, her stomach fluttering. Time to run. Jessica ran for the door, propelling her wobbly knees and sore ankles through sheer force of will. There was no sound from behind her. She's going to be right behind me, she thought widely as she reached the door and turned the knob. She aimed to open with overflowing relief and screamed. Close enough to touch was a molted face, swollen and misshapen. The skin looked too thin, and the bloodshot eyes staring angrily at her. quivering as if they were about to burst. Jessica jerked away, stumbling back into the room. Her eyes darted to his neck, where two rusted lengths of metal protruded from his skin. He stank of mold. The furry suit he wore was covered in it, turning the cloth green, though as Jessica took in the whole of him, she knew it had once been yellow. Springtrap, she breathed, her voice shaky and his lips twitched into something that might have been a smile. Jessica ran to the chair she'd been tied to, putting it between them as if it would do any good. Then horribly, Springtrap began to laugh. Jessica tensed, grasping the chair's wooden back, trying to defend herself, but Springtrap just kept laughing, not moving from the spot where he stood. He cackled on, rising into an impossible pitch. Then he broke off abruptly, his eyes snapping to Jessica. He shuffled closer, then inextricably he began to caper in a grotesque dance as he sang in thin, unsteady dance. Oh, Jessica's been caught. Oh, Jessica, she fought, but now she's going to die. Oh my. Jessica glanced at the animatronic girl in the corner who looked away as though disgusted. Springtrap danced closer, circling Jessica as he repeated the verse, and she hefted the chair between them, watching for a chance to strike. Jessica tripped over her own feet trying to get out of his way. Even for him, this is insane. He danced closer and away. The words he sang degenerate into syllables of nonsense, interrupted by maniacal laughter. Jessica held the chair steady, ready to swing it. Suddenly, Springtrap froze in place. Jessica's arms wavered and she set the chair down with a thud. Springtrap didn't move. Then his face was completely motionless, like someone turned him off. She had briefly finished the thought when his whole body went limp, collapsing on the floor with a clatter. He flickered, then Springtrap faded away, leaving in his place a blank, segmented doll. Jessica whirled to look at the animatronic girl. She was still watching without expression. Enough theatrics. A raspy male voice came from the open door. Jessica, isn't it? The voice wheezed. She squinted, unable to make out anything in the dim light. I know that voice, she said slowly. There was a whirring sound coming from the doorway, and soon Jessica would see something roll into the room. An automated wheelchair of some sort. He was dressed in what looked like white silk pajamas and a black robe of the same cloth, covering him from head to toe. Black leather slippers on his feet. Behind him, three IV bags hung from a wheeled stand. The tubes extended up under the sleeve of his pajama shirt. His head was bald, covered with rigid pink scars. There were no metal pressed in his head as though fused to it. He turned his head slightly, and Jessica saw that while one eye was perfectly normal, the other was simply missing. The gaping socket was dark and shot through a thin steel rod that glinted in the light. He was painfully thin, the bones of his face visible, and he gave Jessica a small, twisted smile. She saw tendons move like snakes beneath the surface of his skin. She had to fight to keep them from reaching. Do you know who I am? He asked. You're William Afton, Jessica thought, but she shook her head, and he sighed, a rattling sound. Come here, he said. I'll stay where I am, she said tightly. As you like. He shifted his weight carefully, the wheelchair laying out a whir as it moved forward slowly. The animatronic girl started toward him, and he waved her off, but the gesture threw off his balance, and for a moment he appeared as though he might fall to the side, but he grabbed the chair of the arm with a pained expression, righting himself. So what was the dance routine for? Jessica asked wildly, and he looked at her as though surprised she was still there. Then he raised his hands to the knot in his robe, his fingers struggling clumsily to undo it. I thought you might like it to see me as I was, a familiar face, he said and smirked. He held up a small disc in his hand and clicked it. The blank doll on the floor suddenly looked as it was a moment ago, with the bloody duplicate William Afton stuffed inside the robot suit. Times changes a lot, he went on, clicking the disc off again, as does pain. When I called myself Springtrap, I was ecstatic with power. delirious over my newfound strength, but pain changes all things, as does time. He opened his robe to reveal his torso. At the center of his chest was a mass of twisted flesh, crossed with neat diagonal lines of black stitching, thread ripping from the wound where the marks of the spring-like suit have scarred over years before, and some scarcely healed. The skin a shiny, angry red. He raised a hand to the wad of stitches, careful not to touch it. Your friend inflicted this new wound, he said mildly, then bent his head slightly forward, calling her attention to his neck. She took an involuntary step closer and gasped. His skin was gone, she thought at first. The innards of his neck laid open in the air, but the blood, he's been dead. Shizuka took a long, slow breath, feeling lightheaded as she tried to make sense of what she saw. The wound had been covered with something else. Plastic. Maybe she could see where the surrounding skin had fused to it. Healing red and ugly. Through the clear material, whatever it was, she could see his throat. She didn't know enough about anatomy to name the parts, but they were red and blue, blocks of muscle and strings of veins or tendons. Wedged in among them were things that never belonged inside a human body. Small scraps of metal embedded in the tissue. There are too many to count. The man moved and then glinted to the light. Jessica gasped and he wheezed, clearly struggling to breathe with his neck turned the way it was. Something caught her eye as he moved and she leaned in closer. She was almost touching him now, and the smell was awful, a noxious perfume of disinfection. She peered through the clear shield and saw it, a spring, its coils wrapped tightly around what looked like three veins. The sharp ends plunged deep into red muscle tissue. Jessica stepped back and almost tripped on the fallen mannequin that had been Springtrap. She knocked away the jumble of limbs, recovering her balance, and looked into the man's humiliated face again. Yeah, no, didn't you used to be a mall guard? She said, his fist clenched and his eyes darkened with fury. Spare me. Dave the Night Guard was a character. One concocted on a moment's notice to play for a fool, and you and your friends. It was insulting. It doesn't take a great thespian to pretend to be an idiot night guard, as long as you can get around inconspicuously. I have not been inconspicuous for some time. It hardly matters now anyway. All of this is for that whiff of me. His voice gargled with despair. Come sit with me, Jessica. The amateur girl dragged his IV stand with one hand, helping him back into the corner where more medical devices and a reclined chair awaited. Jessica eyed the door, bracing herself to move. Then the quiet was broken by what sounded like a child's scream in the distance. What was that? Jessica said. That sounded like a kid. The man ignored her and settled back into the furnished chair. The amateur girl busied herself with the machines around him, attaching the electrodes in his bare scalp and checking the IV bags. A monitor began to beep at slightly irregular intervals, and he waved his hand. Turn that off. I can't stand the sound of it. Jessica, come closer. Stay alive. Play along. Jessica thought to herself as she wearily picked up the chair she'd been tied to, carried it over to the man, and sat. Jessica trained her eyes to the amateur girl as she strode across the room, gripped a handle, and pulled a long table straight out of the wall as if they were going to view a body in a morgue. Jessica clasped her hands over her mouth as fumes of oil burning her flesh washed over her. There was something lying on the table, covered with a plastic sheet. Jessica leaped up again and backed away. What is this? Who did you murder now? She demanded. No one knew, William spirited, almost as though he was trying to laugh. The plastic crinkled. Something was moving inside. What have you done? Jessica gasped. The animatronic girl took a cotton ball from a bag nearby, rolled it from the ball in her hand, and wiped it thoroughly up and down the metal fingers of one hand, then dropped it in a trash can at her feet. She took another piece of cotton and repeated the process, continuing over the surfaces of her hands and forearms up to her elbows. She sterilizing herself. Jessica turned to the man in the chair, keeping the girl in her perpetual gaze. Behind him, the amateur girl was sterilizing a scalpel, using the same care she had taken with her hands.